And I get home and the house is dark, but her bedroom light is on. And by now it's like 10 o'clock. And I was like, oh, shoot. Again, she's up, but maybe she fell asleep with the light on. I don't know. So it was a very nerve-wracking entrance into the house. It was, I could just almost at that point, by the time I got home, I could sense that something was wrong.
Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans. Welcome to the Attic. It's a great thrill for me to welcome to the channel Isabella, who is, like me, an ex-Jehovah's Witness. Isabella, welcome to the Lloyd Evans channel.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I'm very happy to be here.
So you have a very interesting story, and it seems from what I can discern that your exit from the religion actually didn't happen all that long ago. In fact,
Correct.
Was it May 2015 you
Yes.
found yourself disfellowshipped?
Yes.
Okay, so I'm sure there's a whole story there. But before we get to it, perhaps we could back up and learn how you came to be involved with Jehovah's Witnesses in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of my parents were raised around it on both sides. My grandparents kind of went through periods of inactivity, but they always were familiar with the witnesses. And then when my parents met when they were 18, it's kind of when, from my understanding, they got really devoted to it. My mother was always, she clung very tightly to the religion. Both my parents come from abusive households. And so I think all the manipulation tactics of, preying on people who are vulnerable and in emotionally vulnerable states really came into play, particularly with my mother. On her side, it goes back to my great grandmother. So I'm coming from that side of the family. It's woven pretty tightly into the fabric of my family. But for my whole life, we were very devout. We were very involved in congregation activities, and it was always more at the behest of my mother. I think at times my father seemed to just be along for the ride. But we were always very active. We were very involved, and it goes back generations.
Yeah. And when it does go back generations, there's more expectation, isn't there, really, to be a good example for the family?
Yeah, keep the tradition going.
Indeed. So to what extent did you kind of get yourself involved in the congregation? Because, obviously young witnesses are under pressure to enter full-time service or start pioneering, which now involves dedicating 50 hours per month to pioneering. It used to be 70 not so long ago. So, to what extent were you kind of involved?
Yeah, I was pretty deep. I was quite indoctrinated. I was, I believe, 6 or 7 years old when I first joined a theocratic ministry school, which now obsolete. And I remember even younger than that, joining my mother on stage for her talks that she would give at the meetings. So I was very active as far as having parts on the meeting from a very early age. I was baptized when I was 10 at an assembly, which it was a surprise to my mom that I was going through the baptismal questions, but it was always a non-choice for me. Even at the very young age of 10, I knew that that was something that was expected of me. And I knew that if I wanted to continue to stay in good standing and to do those things that are expected of me, like pioneer and reach out for the limited privileges that women have in the organization, that I needed to get baptized. So I was baptized at 10. Even before that, I had parts on the assemblies. I was 7 years old the first time I was interviewed at an assembly, which in my area in Wisconsin, the assembly was about 1,000 people in attendance on average. And our district conventions were closer to 7,000 or 8,000 during my time inside. So first interview on assembly, I was 7 years old, baptized at 10. After that, I had 6 more, what's the word I want? I was on assemblies and conventions 6 more times after that. in combination. I did all sorts of auxiliary pioneering. As soon as I was baptized, I was hopping on that train of getting those 50 hours every month. I wanted to regular pioneer, but with school, there were not enough hours in the day. Already my days were militantly, set up to every second, either being, in school until whatever it was, like 3 o'clock, and trying to stay on top of homework. I was always in, accelerated courses. There just wasn't enough time for me to get 70 hours, but I auxiliary pioneered quite a bit. And that went all the way through high school. And then when I graduated high school, I ended up moving to Guyana, South America with another couple also from Wisconsin to do like need greater work there. They had been there for 2 years prior. Yep. And I met them. They would come back to the States like once a year. And so it was on one of their trips back that one of my good friends on the inside met them, and she's the one who introduced me to them. And so I ended up moving there for just under a year after high school. And I helped build the first Kingdom Hall there, in that it was a very, very remote village. Helped build the first Kingdom Hall and just did full-time preaching. I was a regular pioneer there for, I think, the first 2 months. But there's a whole separate story. I ended up getting removed because someone ratted on me for some stuff I did while I was in high school. So I was removed as a regular pioneer there, but finished the next 7 or 8 months that I was there, putting in, the 70 hours a month anyways.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay. There's a lot to unpack there. So
yeah,
that's quite a big leap to go from graduating high school to being in the middle of nowhere in Guyana.
Yes.
Do you look back on that experience in a positive way? Because it must have been, quite an interesting experience for a young person to go through to kind of be in a completely different part of the world, in an isolated community, doing something that at least at the time you felt was meaningful.
Yeah, going to Guyana, it kind of was a twofold reasoning on my part. Because of, and I know you said we'll kind of get into this later, but because of the reason I was disfellowshipped, it was getting into a relationship with a non-believer while I was in high school, while I was 16. So that caused a lot of issues at home. There was a lot of fights with my mother. There was a lot of unrest in our home. There was a lot of weaponized shepherding call visits that were made while I was 16, 17 years old, trying to get me to fall back in line. And when this opportunity presented itself to move to Guyana, because I visited this couple for about 2 weeks, my senior year of high school, and just fell in love with it. Life was hard. Taking a shower was hard. Getting clean water to drink was hard. And you got out of your bubble. You got away from the everyday stress of what we're used to here in the States, being in a first world country, my own personal problems of this very tense relationship with my mother, a very rocky relationship with the congregation. I was back and forth for quite a while. I was desperate to get out right around the time I was 17. So finding Guyana, I've always loved traveling. It served as a way to get me out. It was an easy exit for me to kind of, I don't want to say run away from my problems, but essentially do that, get away from the people who knew that there was unrest in our home, get away from the elders who had been visiting our home, who I just loathed, get away from a lot of those expectations and just get a little bit of freedom, I guess. But it was a very cool experience. I do still look back on that very positively. I started a second book. I'm about 40, 50 pages in of just short stories of things that happened to me while I was there, whether it was funny stuff or scary stuff or new foods or, all that exciting stuff that comes with moving somewhere so foreign, so different to you. So I do look back on it positively, but I do have moments where I feel almost guilty for the Bible studies that I had there. All the Bible students, I really connected with a lot of the young girls in the community, just because of the culture of the Guyanese people. particularly where I was, there were not a lot of men because it's kind of the last stop before you go into bush and raw jungle where they're gold mining. So the death
Mm.
rate is really high. So there's way more women than men. So women are always at each other's necks. Like the concept of being friends is kind of not as common there. And so I was able to really connect and thus manipulate, many girls my age or younger, and honestly thinking that I was doing something good, that I was helping them, that I was teaching them something that was worthwhile, that was life saving. Now, where I am today, and now that I've deconstructed so much, I do have moments where I look back on it and feel very guilty for, a lot of the Bible studies I did there. But overall, it was a really cool experience.
Mm. I have similar kind of recollections from doing need grating work or work where the need is greater in the Dominican Republic. I think those are memories that we can still cherish and take value from, even if we were in a messed up situation, doing the best that we could with the information that we had to hand. But it sounds like you had a really stressful time with, like you say, the elders back home. Would it be fair to say that they were invasive regarding your romantic life?
Yes, absolutely. And I was able to keep the relationship as pretty private. I mean, my mom had suspicions that I was hanging out with worldly people and that I was spending too much time at school. So she kind of put two and two together and assumed that I was in a relationship. But as far as getting those shepherding visits and talking to the elders, never once did I actually admit to doing anything until it came to my judicial committee meetings. And those were by far the most traumatic thing that I've ever been through. They were horrific. So that is kind of, I guess, a whole story in and of itself. But leading up, during those teenage years, it was very invasive. I remember being extremely frustrated with my mother for using them against me, because I remember feeling very strongly that this is not their house. We are not their family. It is none of their business what is going on in my life, in our lives, in this house. And of course, her being very devout still to this day, she saw it as the traditional, they're here to help us. They're here to guide us. They're here to shepherd us and to offer us help. But it always felt very weaponized. We'd have a huge argument and she'd come into my room with the Bible and I'd tell her to get the hell out. Like, don't throw the Bible in my face. It always felt very intrusive, very abrasive, very weaponized against me. It was never a pleasant experience.
But I'm curious. I mean, obviously, it's entirely up to you how much you go into this, and I can appreciate it's a very traumatic episode in your life. Typically to form a judicial committee, there needs to be actual evidence, and you're saying that never once did you admit to any wrongdoing. So how on earth were they able to form a judicial committee in the end if there was actually no evidence and it was purely your mother's suspicions?
Yes, that's a very interesting story. So I was in Guyana. I came home like April of 2015. And while I was there, this ex-boyfriend of mine from high school, he had gotten back in touch with me via Facebook at the time. And it was strictly platonic. He was just like, yo, you're in South America. What are you doing? That looks super, super cool. Tell me about it. So, we messaged back and forth, and I brought him a cool, it's called a calabash fruit, a cool fruit bowl back that was popular with like the native Guyanese people. So I came home about a week or two later. I was like, hey, I brought you something back. Let me come drop it off for you. So stupidly, I left my iPad at home that day, which I had my iPad in Guyana to use on studies, instead of having all this printed literature, it's very humid there. So I had this iPad. Subsequently, lots of pictures with the locals on there. So I had taken the passcode off because I had gotten sick of having to type it in every time that I went to go show someone pictures. So I was like, oh, this is stupid. Let me just take it off and I can go in, whatever. So I left it at home that day, not really thinking anything of it. I go to this guy's house. I end up being there for quite a while because he had roommates at the time. And all of us had been on the drum line together in high school. So it was fun, nice little reunion, get to see everyone again. So I go, we're hanging out. Next thing I know, it's like 9:30. And I was like, oh, shoot, this is way too late. I had come early in the afternoon. And when I checked my phone, I didn't have any texts or calls from my mom, which was very unusual. And I was like, this is either a really good thing or a really bad thing. Like immediately, I knew going home was going to be one end of the spectrum or the other. There was going to be no happy medium with that. So I'm driving home and I'm thinking of all these excuses to tell her as far as like why I was out so late, where I was, who I was with, which was standard for her, as a standard reaction from her. And I get home and the house is dark, but her bedroom light is on. And by now it's like 10 o'clock. And I was like, oh, shoot. Again, she's up, but maybe she fell asleep with the light on. I don't know. So it was a very nerve-wracking entrance into the house. I could just almost at that point, by the time I got home, I could sense that something was wrong. And that night, I was walking past her doorway and she ended up stopping me. She had found my iPad. She had gone in and looked through all of my Facebook messages, which she loved to do through my childhood, loved to read through my texts and take my phone and look through, all of that stuff, read my journals, my diaries. So she had looked through the messages. She had seen that we were in communication and just kind of, I forget, there might have been something specific where we were like reminiscing on something when we were together, something that kind of hinted at a relationship there. And so she basically gave me an ultimatum. She was like, you know what? I think you dated this boy. I think you slept with him. I think you've had sex. Either you go to the congregation elders and tell them, or I will.
That's just supposition. That's just completely supposition.
Ridiculous, right? Yeah. And so at that point, I was so over it. Like I said, there was a period of time while I was dating this boy and right after I had broken up with him, so between 16 and 17, where I was desperate to get out. I had a breakdown one day at school talking to my friend Peter, where I was like, I am so trapped. I am so stuck. There's no one who will help me because my entire family is in. I looked into getting emancipated even, which you need your parent to sign off on. So I knew that was not a legitimate route that I could go down. But traveling in Guyana, I had found a way to survive in the organization. I was like, if I can travel, if I can kind of just get away from all this and be my own independent person, I can survive. I can just forget that all happened and move forward with my life. And so for her to kind of throw that in my face, I want to be like, dude, this was 3 years ago. I have pioneered. I moved to a different continent to serve where the need is great. Like, what more do you want from me? What more can I do to show that I'm dedicated to this church? Like, you want to dig all this up? You want me to tell the elders and to own up? Okay, fine, I will, because you don't know anything that happened. Like, what are you going to do? You're going to go to them and say, oh, I think she did X, Y, Z. So I was like, you want me to go to them? I will, but what's going to happen. And so that's exactly how it went down. The next meeting, I pulled aside an elder that I thought had the highest chance of taking pity on me. I pulled him aside and I tearfully told him about what had happened years prior. And from there, my judicial committee was formed.
So there must have been something in what you said that gave them enough, because bear in mind, elders are able to disfellowship someone based on strong circumstantial evidence, although that's usually to do with adultery. So clearly there was something
I told him.
I
was gonna say, I was honest about it. I went to him, told him I had a relationship with this kid. We had, been intimate, blah, 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 right. That it was my mom. Yeah. So at that
makes
point,
more sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. During the shepherding visits, a couple of years prior, kept my mouth shut. But then once this was it felt like everything was coming to a head, and I had been trying for so many years to keep that secret and locked away and private. And it just felt like I couldn't do it anymore. You can only fight for so long. And so I think I had kind of given up at that point. I told them everything, spilled the beans. And then, obviously they have me admitting to doing these things that they can move forward then with the committee.
Okay. So, I mean, you've already kind of hinted at what it was, your treatment by the elders, but presumably these judicial committees were no fun at all.
No, oh my gosh. I know that I was very traumatized by them because so I had five brothers. I know it can range from like 3 to 5, I think, from my understanding, but I have five. And all of them
It's
were,
weird for them to have five, to be fair. I mean, it
is
would be
it?
three. Yeah. Typically it would be three unless there was some extraordinary reason why you would need there to be other elders there.
Yeah, no,
Um,
there was five of them.
maybe they just they view it as entertainment.
That's how it felt, honestly,
Yeah. Yeah.
because all five of them I had known since childhood, and I can only remember three of their faces. So I know that I've blocked a lot of that out, which
Mm.
I found a new therapist, a second therapist to work with this coming fall to help me kind of try to unpack that because I would like to unpack it and deal with it and move forward from it as best I can. But so five elders, I had three meetings with them over the course of 3 weeks, which 3 weeks when you're going through these feels like an eternity. It felt so long because in the meantime, you're still having to go to meetings and see them. You're seeing them up on stage. They were coming up and greeting me at the meetings as if everything is fine. Meanwhile, during these meetings, I show up outside of, meeting service hours. The Kingdom Hall's dark with just the light on in the elders room. I come in, I fill the only empty seat at this table. They close the door and they just proceed to interrogate me about, did you have sex? Where did you have sex? How often? Did you use protection? Does he masturbate? Do you masturbate? Did he orgasm? Did you orgasm? Just the most vile questions that you can think to ask a young woman about this. And they would interrogate me. They would throw a scripture in my face and they would excuse me from the room to go sit in the auditorium, which I didn't even have the decency to turn some lights on for me. So I got to go sit in the dark and they would close the door, discuss, file away to in their little spank thing. I don't know. I don't know what they were
I
doing in
think they
there.
were just using you for titillation, weren't they? Basically, especially if they were
Essentially,
dragging it out over such a long period.
yes. And then they will call me back in and pick up right where they left off. And these meetings would go
Mm.
for hours, 2 hours, 3 hours. And I would be so drained from those. I think it was after the second one, I came home. And of course, I'm crying through the whole thing because it's so violating. I mean, they're forcing this information out of me. They raped me of my truth. It's these people that I was taught to trust and that are looking out for me, and here they are harassing me, mentally, emotionally, verbally, spiritually assaulting me. Like it was so traumatizing. I came home after the second meeting. My mom would never say anything to me. I would come home and it would be very clear that I had been crying. I went up to my room and I laid in bed for a full day. I didn't eat. I didn't change my clothes. I didn't go to the bathroom. I closed my blinds and I laid in bed in the dark for a whole day because it was brutal. It was really, really brutal. And just going into the next one was just harder and harder with each of the subsequent meetings. You know what I mean? Because I knew what was coming. At least for the first one, I was blindsided by it,
Mm.
but the second meeting and the third meeting, I knew it was coming and it was awful. It was really awful.
I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah. So you end up getting disfellowshipped at the age of 19. And I think that was it May 2015 that happened.
Yep.
Talk us through, the impact of that. What was it like when they told you were disfellowshipped, and what was the sort of immediate aftermath?
Yeah. Surprisingly, I was relieved more than anything when they told me their decision. I don't know if I was relieved that the ordeal was just over. It certainly felt like good news that those meetings were ending. Um, but I did. I felt a sense of relief because even though I had kind of done like a personal rededication to the organization, somewhere inside was still that 17-year-old who was desperate to get out. But now, I was old enough where I was a legal adult, but still, it's that two-edged sword of you're never able to be close enough with worldly people, because they only want you to be close to those in the congregation. So now that I have an opportunity to leave the congregation, I have no one on the outside because I never cultivated any of those friendships. So I was relieved, but concerned about where I was going to end up. And initially, my mother had a favorable reaction. I was surprised. Initially, the day that I told her, it was, we can get through this. I still love you, blah, blah, blah. You can stay at the house. Well, within a week, ironically, like right after my disfellowshipping announcement, which I did not go to because I thought that was the most masochistic thing that someone could do. My mother was irate, but I didn't go to that. Shortly after that, I don't know if it was that next weekend or the following, we were supposed to go see the new Bethel in Warwick. So obviously I would not be going to that trip, but my mother and brother did. And the morning they left, I came downstairs and came home to a note from my mother saying that I was cut off from the inheritance money that we got when my father passed in 2011, that I had 2 weeks to get out of the house, that I had to leave my phone and all accessories at the house because we were on a family plan, and that she took my violin, which was a gift from her mom, my grandmother on that side, that it was a violin that had kind of come down through the family generations. I don't know what that had anything to do with. I still to this day think it was a little bit out of spite.
So basically, she stole your property.
Yes, totally.
Right. Yeah.
So 2 weeks then, they were going to be gone for that next full week. And, kind of during those judicial committee meetings, I had felt, I had figured I would get disfellowshipped. And so I had maintained communication with my ex-boyfriend through those. He had expressed an interest in getting back together, but I was like, listen, I found a way to kind of survive in this without having to lose all my friends and family. So if I can, that's what I'm going to pursue. But then all this happened. So I was like, hey, I'm going to be homeless in 2 weeks. My mom's kicking me out. And he invited me, told me that I could come live with him and his parents. His parents were cool with it. They are my saviors still to this day, because otherwise, if it weren't for them, I would have ended up at a homeless shelter. There was one 3 blocks from our house. And that was a really big reality for me. Trying to figure out where on earth I was going to go, since I knew that none of my family was going to help me. None of my friends were going to help me. I was kind of just forced back into this relationship. I mean, to be fair, I did still have feelings for him. That was genuine. But the thought of allowing myself to have feelings,
it wasn't
for
really
him,
on your terms, was it? It was
right.
Something, yeah.
Right. And it was scary. The thought of having feelings for him was scary because that's what put me in this position in the first place. So I had suppressed those for a really long time, trying to make it as a witness. And now all of a sudden, all this had happened. And so it was just scary. It was scary to think about going back into the same relationship that put me in this position in the first time. So my mom, she would cancel my car insurance and tell me like days later, which I don't know how it is in Europe, but it's super illegal to drive without car insurance. So wouldn't tell me about that. She'd send me emails like, oh, I had to tell so-and-so about you today. I hope you're proud of the decisions you're making. So it was a very initially good response, like first 24 hours. And then after that, just cut out, get out of the house, completely cold shoulder.
I would have said, you do
spiteful.
realize stealing is a disfellowshipping offense and you stole my violin,
I know. And I even tried to get it back with no luck.
Yeah.
So it was jarring, jarring immediately after.
Wow. Well, I think jarring is putting it mildly. You were, it sounds like, in something of an existential crisis. How do I physically get through this situation in one piece? So, the fact that you're here and able to talk about it, and you're coherent, and and not in pieces. It's a huge testament to your strength and bravery. So,
thank you.
Presumably you've done lots of healing since then.
Yes, I mean, existential crisis. Yes, I was not, the first year and a half of being disfellowshipped, I kind of just blocked it all out. I lived with my ex and his parents for just 2 months, and we had saved enough to get our own apartment. At the end of that lease, he broke up with me, which was devastating because I had gotten really close with his family. And he helped me move into my own apartment, and then we just kind of split ways. And I'll never forget that first night of being in that apartment after the breakup. I'd only lived there for maybe about a month. I remember standing in my kitchen, staring at the corner of the wall, just sobbing, because I was like, how did I get here? Like, what honestly have I done to deserve this? Because I felt so abandoned. I had been stripped of my identity, stripped of who I was. I had lost everything that had ever had any meaning to me, everyone that I had loved, and I didn't know who I was anymore. And so I didn't have the ability financially or mentally, emotionally to seek out help at that time. So I ended up, getting into substance abuse and self-harm and all sorts of different ways to try to self-medicate and just survive the emotional and mental toll of going through something like that cumulatively. So about 2 years after that breakup, my mental health got really bad. It really deteriorated. There was a lot of anxiety, some depression mixed in, some more self-harm was getting mixed in there. And I came home from work. I had started traveling for work, which was a big goal of mine. So, I had really good things going. I had, my dream job. I was traveling the country. I had a good group of friends finally at that point. I was seeing somebody who was treating me very well. And yet I would still come home from work and just cry. And I wasn't able to put my finger on why I was feeling so upset. And there was one day in particular, came home from work, the usual crying, laying on my bed. And it all just kind of came to a head. I was like, I'm either going to go buy some razor blades or I'm going to go get a gym membership so that I can work through this trauma physically, and thankfully, I don't know what it was. I don't know what allowed the logical, reasonable side of myself to come through, but I got the gym membership. So that was a positive thing. And it was actually through one of your videos where you interviewed Daryl Ray that he talked about the Journey Free organization. That as soon as I heard him say that, I paused the video, I went and checked out their website, and it was exactly what I needed. This is what they specialize in, is spiritual trauma. And so coming out of kind of like the thick of it, of the worst of my mental health and my emotional health, finding that website was life-changing. A little emotional.
Wow. Yeah. Well, so I'm so glad that it had that impact. Yeah, for you at that difficult time. Yeah,
it did. It really did. So I worked with him. I got this amazing coach, Emily. She actually ended up writing the foreword for my book, so that was cool.
Yeah.
Full circle. So I did a lot of healing with her. I did. For me, it was the vocabulary, getting the vocabulary for what had happened and just the validation, I think.
Yeah. Because I think this is a really, really important point to stress, is that we're talking about trauma. We're talking about religious trauma or spiritual trauma syndrome. And it's not something that to be trifled with. It's not something where, Jehovah's Witness family members can just kind of mess around with you and guilt trip you into putting yourself back into a traumatic experience. And so I think it's really, really admirable that you were able to educate yourself on this, because it sounds like, in terms of your mental health, you'd reached a point of desperation. And if you'd allowed, the sort of guilt tripping treatment by Jehovah's Witness friends and family to drag you back in, you probably wouldn't be here now,
Absolutely.
So the fact that you were able to get the resources that you needed, I mean, I can only talk about this stuff on my channel. Ultimately, the information is meaningless if, number one, no one's watching it, and number two, people are watching it, but they're not doing anything about their personal situation. So,
right.
you took that information, you were brave enough to sit through one of my videos, and you were also brave enough to do something about it. So that's a huge testament to your character.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot. It was tough. It was painful, but it was worth it. And that's what I tell people, it's because I feel like I got a whole new lease on life, once you're able to deconstruct and identify, the manipulation and the gaslighting and the abuse that happens inside. And I know so many people go through judicial committees. That's not something that's unique to me. And there's other types of abuse that go on as we've been seeing the past few years, everything that's coming out of Australia and Pennsylvania and even Norway, how they've revoked the religious status of the witnesses. So I know there's other kinds of abuse that goes on, but being able to just kind of sort through that and learn. One of my favorite things that I learned from Emily was the neural pathways. I don't know if I'm sure you have heard of neural pathways, but just I was getting so frustrated. I would be with people who would kind of poo-poo the Bible. It's not true. It's just a collection of stories, blah, blah, blah. And even though consciously I knew that I didn't believe the witness teachings anymore, I would have this gut instinct reaction to defend the Bible. And I hated it because it would happen again and again and again. And so I brought this up to her and I was like, what is going on with this? And she explained that neural pathways are the synapses in your brain through the dogma and the teachings of the witnesses. These synapses now fire in a certain pattern, and that gives you that gut reaction. But the good news is that you can train those synapses to fire in a different pattern. And so learning that was really huge for me because I was like, oh my God, I'm not crazy. This is so validating. This organization, I mean, that's still such a nice word for what it is, but they have the ability to change your physical body.
Cabal is another word. Yeah. Go on.
Yes. My goodness. But they can change how your brain works, like how your physical brain fires and works. So it was so validating to learn that. It was so interesting, but it was so relieving to know that I could reverse that I could change that. It gave me some of that power back, that I had lost through this whole process. I felt like I had no power, no say of my life and what was going on in it. But it was stuff like that was really what I needed, the validation to know I wasn't crazy, that this is real, exactly what you're saying. This trauma is very real. Religious trauma syndrome is very serious and it can affect people in very serious ways. And so I only worked with her for like 4.5 months, but my growth was just exponential. I really was able then to kind of take off and have a much, much happier life after getting that help with them.
Fantastic. And so that was really a turning point, was it? And now
Yes.
You're at the point where, as we were just saying off camera, you're at the point where you're on the kind of cusp of publishing a book. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So it's called I Am No Longer. And I took it from the disfellowshipping announcement. How they will say, Isabella Estes is no longer one of Jehovah's Witnesses. So it was the first title that I came up with, and it's just resonated with me through the whole process. So it's stuck. Hopefully it will be
so
available.
Instead of them making the announcement on your behalf, it's almost like you're making the announcement. You're taking ownership of, right. I get it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And coming through this whole experience of years of, the fallout from going through that, I really want to pay it forward. I never want another ex Jehovah's Witness or disfellowship person or inactive or someone from another culty group to go through what I had to go through, because in the thick of it, I didn't know what my resources were. I didn't feel like I had any resources. And now, even though my list is small, it's a list,
Mm,
and I put it in the back of my book. Your YouTube channel is one of them. Journey Free is another one of them. Daryl Ray and his books and works is another one. There's a lot out there that can help people like us to deconstruct and to work through our trauma. And so that was my goal. I wanted to share my story. I want people to know that they're not alone when they leave, either of their own accord, which is something I greatly admire, or if they get disfellowshipped or whatever the situation is.
mm,
Because I think just telling our stories is so important. We're seeing now, all sorts of stuff coming from the organization legally with the child abuse cases. And people, we wouldn't know about that if people didn't tell their story.
mm.
And it's tough because the people who are really in it, who are really devoted and, dare I say, brainwashed and mind controlled, people like my mother, even if they hear these things, will they believe it? Will they take it at face value? Probably not, but you never know. I think the people inside at least deserve the opportunity to hear these things, to hear these experiences, and hopefully make a decision of their own,
Mm,
how they want to proceed with the organization. But so that's
sure.
my motivation is for writing this book. I want this book to be a resource in and of itself. I want people to know that they're not alone, that they don't have to sit in existential dread if they don't want.
Well, the book's not out yet, but once the
Correct.
book is released in whatever form, could you please post a comment on this video and I'll pin it so
Yeah.
that people can just check if it's a pinned comment and they can go right ahead and order the book
Yeah.
once it's out. How's that?
Yeah.
So,
Absolutely. And I
yeah.
have an Instagram page as well that I'll post it on. It's Izzy_, and then the
Hmm.
title, I Am No Longer. So if people want, they can give me a follow. It's a public page, and I'll make an announcement on there as well once it's
Sure.
finally published and out and available.
Fantastic. And if I could ask a personal question, you know,
Yeah.
everyone's journey after leaving a group like Jehovah's Witnesses takes them in personal directions in terms of faith and belief. Where has your journey taken you in that regard?
That's a good question. Um, I don't think I believe in a God that is presented in organized Christianity.
Hmm.
That's something that just doesn't resonate with me. Through my work with Emily and Journey Free, I kind of went down the theological rabbit hole for a little while, just learning about, how the Bible was translated into scripts and, how we got the canon that we have today. And a lot of it just doesn't make sense for me to believe in the prescribed Christian God. But I do think
Hmm.
there's something out there. I, got into energy work, which was something that was able to give me more comfort about my father passing than the witnesses were ever able to give me. Just knowing that, scientifically, energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can change form, but you can't destroy energy. And so just knowing that with my father, his energy isn't destroyed. It's just changed forms, perhaps.
Hmm.
Still out there somewhere. And so energy work has resonated a lot with me. Um, Definitely more on like the tangible, measurable, scientific end of it. But I think I'm still in my journey of figuring out where I am in my spirituality and my beliefs. I don't think by any means that I have reached a conclusion yet.
But isn't it great that you get to take that journey at your own pace and make your own
Yes,
discoveries and that kind of thing? Yeah.
yes, and
Yeah.
not have things be threatened with death and Armageddon or all sorts of stuff being disfellowshipped. Well, here we are, not
Yeah.
being threatened with worst case scenarios. Yeah, just kind of being able to explore and to yeah, to look into different things and to see what resonates. Yeah.
Absolutely. And finally, one last question, which I obviously ask to all fellow ex-members. If anyone is on the fence watching this video, perhaps physically and mentally out Jehovah's Witness, or someone who is in two minds as to whether to, start down that rabbit hole of discovering, whether it's the truth or not, what would be your advice to them?
Do it. Don't be afraid of apostate resources. There's in so many of even just your videos, we find that the Watchtower misquotes so many things. I was just recently listening to, I think, your manipulations, the 11 manipulations video, and the one about divorce, and how I think it was like Robert Weiss, how Watchtower completely misquoted him about this divorce. And so don't take the society's publications at face value. If you're thinking about doing research, do it. If you're thinking about leaving, probably do it. I mean, it's painful and it's very difficult, but there is a whole community of us out here. There is a support system. There is people who want to help you and who care truly unconditionally. It's not conditional on, your position in the congregation, your standing with the congregation or God. We are out here. There's a community out here, and we would love to welcome anyone else who wants to leave.
Lovely, lovely words. Thank you so much, Isabella. And again, I'm filled with admiration for the way you've overcome considerable trauma in your life, and you've healed, and you're now paying it forward and helping others. So well done.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Viewers, I hope you've enjoyed this interview. I certainly have. Don't forget that you can watch similar interviews by subscribing to the Lloyd Evans channel, but that's all we have time for. Thank you for watching.